July 9, 1944, La Roche-Guyon, German-occupied France. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commander of Army Group B, stood in the medieval chateau that served as his headquarters. -1 kilometers from the front lines of the Normandy invasion, the Allied breakout was weeks away from succeeding. German losses in men and material were catastrophic and irreplaceable. Rommel had already told Hitler directly, in a memorandum days earlier, that the war in the West could not be won militarily. He knew it, his staff knew it. What he did not yet know was that men close to him were preparing to act on that knowledge in a way that would force him to choose a side he had spent his entire career voting. If this is the kind of history that matters to you, a story where the record actually holds up, where the details come from documents and memoirs and logs rather than myth, then subscribe to this channel and leave a like before we go further. Costs you nothing and it tells us this work is worth continuing. By July 1944, Rommel was 52 years old, a field marshal since 1942, and arguably the most publicly celebrated soldier in Germany, the Desert Fox of the North African campaign, a man Hitler himself had once used as propaganda gold. But his standing with Berlin had eroded badly. He had clashed repeatedly with the high command over strategy in Normandy, pushing for armor closer to the coast and, being overruled, Allied air superiority had crippled German mobility. Rommel commanded roughly 500,000 men in Army Group B, defending against a beachhead that was, by his own private assessment, no longer containable. He was a man whose military judgment had been proven right and whose authority was being ignored, a dangerous position for any officer under the Nazi regime. This was not a written order from the Führer, it was something more delicate and, in its way, more dangerous, a direct approach from his own staff, Lieutenant Colonel Caesar von Hofacker, a cousin of Stauffenberg's collaborator and a liaison between the Paris-based resistance circle and Rommel's headquarters, came to La Roche-Guyon, asked Rommel, in essence, whether he would lend his name and his authority to a plan already in motion against Hitler. There was no legal order here, quite the opposite. What was being asked of Rommel was treason under German military law, carrying an unambiguous death sentence under the Reich's wartime statutes if discovered elsewhere. In the German officer corps, the response to similar approaches was very different, and the consequences were already visible by mid-1944. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, who would briefly succeed Rommel in command of Army Group B, oscillated for months between sympathy for the conspirators and fear of acting, ultimately doing nothing decisive when the moment came. Other officers approached by the resistance simply reported the contact to the Gestapo outright, and those conversations ended in arrest, interrogation, and execution for the men who had reached out. The machinery waiting on the other side of a wrong answer was not theoretical. Hofacker himself, after the July 20th plot collapse, would be captured, tortured, and hanged in Plötzensee prison that August, a fate that hung over every word exchanged with Rommel weeks earlier, according to post-war accounts from his chief of staff Hans Speidel, who was present for or briefed on these conversations at La Roche-Guyon. Rommel did not agree to join an assassination plot. His objection was reportedly as much practical as moral. Killing Hitler, he believed, would make a martyr of him and could plunge Germany into civil war or chaos at the worst possible moment, with the Western Allies and the Soviets both bearing down on German soil. What Rommel reportedly indicated he could support was a negotiated end to the war, removing Hitler from power through arrest or forced resignation, then opening surrender talks with the Western Allies, ideally before the Eastern Front collapsed entirely. Speidel's post-war testimony describes Rommel as engaged, troubled, and unwilling to simply turn the men away, but also unwilling to put his name to a killing for a man in Rommel's position. Even listening to this conversation without reporting, it was already an act of extraordinary danger. Officers had been executed for far less direct involvement than what Rommel was being asked to consider. His relationship with Hitler was already strained over Normandy strategy, and the Gestapo's surveillance of senior officers had intensified as Berlin grew more paranoid about the war's collapsing fronts. Had this meeting been reported, or had the July 20th plot succeeded and unraveled differently, Rommel's fame would have offered him no protection at all. If anything, a field marshal's involvement would have been treated as a more serious betrayal, not a lesser one, and dealt with accordingly. This was not the first time Rommel had quietly drawn a line between obedience and complicity. In North Africa, he had refused to apply the regime's harsher racial policies against captured Jewish soldiers and local populations, a position noted in several Allied and German post-war accounts of his conduct in that theater. He had also developed a reputation, recorded by his aide Heinz Werner Schmidt and others around him, for treating prisoners of war according to the conventions of soldierly conduct rather than ideology. Cal doctrine, at a time when this was increasingly rare on other fronts. None of this made him a resistor in any organized sense for most of the war. He served loyally, sought Hitler's favor, and built his career within the regime's structure for years. But these smaller refusals formed a pattern that, by the summer of 1944, was converging with the larger crisis facing Germany, thought in his letters to his wife Lucy around this period. Collected in the Rommel papers edited by Basil Littlehart, Rommel's tone is increasingly weary and clipped, focused on the military catastrophe unfolding around him, rather than political conspiracy directly. A reminder that his surviving correspondence rarely spells out the riskiest conversations explicitly, for obvious reasons of self-preservation. What emerges instead, through Speidel and through his own later memoranda, is a soldier's logic layer over a moral one. Rommel seems to have concluded that Germany's only realistic path forward was ending the war before total destruction arrived, and that Hitler's removal from power, not his death, was the version of that outcome he could square with his own conscience and his understanding of the army's duty to the German people, rather than to one man. The stakes of this conversation extended well beyond Rommel personally. Army Group B's roughly 500,000 men in Normandy were, by his own assessment, fighting a battle that could not be won and would only grow costlier the longer it continued. Hofacker, who carried this conversation back to the wider conspiracy in Paris and Berlin, would be among those executed in its aftermath. Speidel himself would later face arrest and interrogation by the Gestapo for his proximity to these events. Narrowly surviving the war, the civilians and soldiers on both sides who continued dying in Normandy through the late summer of 1944 were, in Rommel's own private reasoning, the human cost of a war he increasingly believed Germany's leadership should have already ended. This conversation did not emerge from nowhere. It followed years of accumulating disillusionment, Stalingrad's catastrophic loss in early 1943, which Rommel watched unfold from North Africa with growing alarm at Hitler's strategic judgment, and his own first-hand experience by 1944 of orders from Berlin that ignored battlefield reality entirely. 3 days after this conversation with Hofacker, on July 17, 1944, Rommel was severely wounded when his staff car was strafed by Allied aircraft, removing him from active command just 3 days before the July 20th plot against Hitler was carried out and failed. He would never return to the front. His exact knowledge of and involvement in the conspiracy would become the subject Hitler's regime obsessed over in the weeks that followed. That obsession reached its conclusion on October 14, 1944, when two generals arrived at Rommel's home with a choice already made for him: suicide by poison, framed publicly as death from his wounds, or trial, disgrace, and the destruction of his family. He chose the poison. The state funeral that followed was theater, a final use of his name by the regime he had served for most of his life and quietly broken from at its end. The conversation with Hofacker in July did not make Rommel a conspirator in any clean sense. He never fired a shot or planted a bomb. But that marked the moment his private doubts crossed into something Berlin could no longer forgive. And 3 months later, it cost him his life.